Hey, National Park Church. I'm here with Lana Shoemaker for us to have a conversation about suffering and grief, God's relationship with that, and also how can we love one another through that. So, Lana, welcome to the first ever NPC podcast.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be a part of the first ever.
So before we dive into this really deep and heavy topic, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing while you've been quarantined?
Oh, well, Tyson is here with me. He's home from Harding, and so we've been having a really good time. He's studying. It's a very rigorous curriculum that he has, but we've been finding a lot of time to just enjoy each other's company. Sometimes it's real late at night or early in the morning, but he plays guitar, so he serenades me a lot, and we just get outside and go for a walk, and just we're managing. We're doing just fine.
So Lana earlier in the week, or I guess it was last week, shared with me a video of her making Tyson, who's a Harding student, go to chapel at her house, which I thought was pretty hilarious. So brought back a lot of good memories.
Yeah.
But I wanted us to have this conversation just to kind of set the stage for everybody else. I bet about a month and a half ago to 2 months ago, our life group was talking a little bit about what are some barriers for people that keep them from being able to become Christian or be part of the church. And we started talking about suffering and people wrestling with that. And then you and Cheryl started sharing some of your experiences of suffering and what's been helpful. And it just was an incredible conversation. I know that our whole life group was very tuned in to what you guys were saying, and I wanted to find an avenue to share that with the rest of the church. So that's why I have you here to have this conversation with us. I'm wondering if you could begin with just sharing your story. What are some of your experiences from life that relate to grief and suffering, and just give us a little taste of what your story has been like.
Okay. In 2008, John was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. The prognosis was not good. And for about a week, we cried and grieved that. And then one day we just said, you know what, we're not going to steal the joy of every day by being sad. So we're just going to take one day at a time, because this is in God's hand. So whatever the statistics say, it's still in God's hands. And so that's exactly what we did. So throughout the 7.5 years of his life, we really just tried to take one day at a time. And it was really a very joyous time. Actually, I remember John saying at one point, I'm really glad I got cancer. And at the time I wasn't really glad he got cancer, but I understood where he was coming from, because it completely changed his priorities and just made us cherish what we had together so much the more. And looking back on it now, I just see that it probably was, as much as I thought we had just this perfect life together. I see those as being some of the most joyful times in our marriage. It was very, it brought us both closer together, and it brought us both much closer to God.
I'd love for you to share, what are some ways that y'all became more intentional with one another after finding that news out? How did your relationship with John change in light of his diagnosis?
Well, as far as my relationship with him he was always the person that, he treated me like a princess. He didn't want me to do anything. He was always doing for me. And he was really strong and not afraid of anything, and very venturesome. And during the course of his sickness, the roles reversed. Mm-hmm. So then I was treating him like the prince. I had to care for his every need there toward the end, all basic needs. And so that was a real role reversal, but it was just, it was really my great privilege to be able to do so. I really consider it so. And during the course of that time, we prayed a lot more, of course, not just during the tough times, but during the good times too. We studied the Bible together more. Our devotionals became more regular, but just you truly learn how you can love somebody more than yourself when you go through something like that. And during that last year, especially, I learned, let me back up just a bit. I always thought that if I worked harder or I tried harder or I gave more effort, that I could affect the outcome of something. And so I think I gave myself credit for more than I should have along the way. And I realized that I'm not in charge of anything. I really am not. And I learned that during that last year, I was able to perform physically in a way that I never could have. And it was simply by God's strength and by his grace. Because I look back on it and think, how could anybody do that physically? How can you hold up under that? But actually, he just gave me felt like a superhuman strength during that time. And I know that was directly from God. There was no way, based upon my history, that I could have done some of the things that I was able to do to care for him in those last months.
Yeah, man.
It also taught me something else. It taught me, I'm sorry. It taught me, this is staying in the house here, being isolated. It's no big deal to me because we did that for a year.
Yeah. I'm wondering, how long was it after the diagnosis to when you guys said, okay, we're going to soak up every minute of every day with one another? When did that kind of switch turn for you guys?
It was about a week. It was about a week. And I remember it specifically. We were lying across the bed crying and just saying, why us? When did this happen to us? We just enjoy each other so much. And we just had such a blessed life. Why is this happening to us? And we don't want it to be over soon, because they were talking maybe a matter of months. We just didn't want it to be over that soon. And just stretched across the bed that afternoon crying. We just looked at each other and said, we're not going to do this. We are not going to steal every day by doing this. And so, and John was such a positive person. And he said, well, they said I have a 6% survival rate. So somebody has to be in that 6%. Right. It might as well be me. So I think his really positive attitude helped me be positive too. Yeah.
So obviously, for a lot of us that are going through suffering and difficulties, the question arises of, how did your faith in God make a difference in that? But also, how has your relationship with God maybe changed after going through a situation like walking with John through such a difficult time?
Well, to me, it's grief is like an Emmaus walk. It's you don't realize who's right there beside you the whole way until you're well into your journey, or it's nearing the end. And so I can't imagine going through this and not having God, because it's tough enough. Because faith doesn't make it easy by any means, but it just makes it possible.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And I'm wondering, is there anything about the way you understood yourself and maybe understood God that's different now after going through a situation? Maybe something that you used to be really confident about, but you think differently of? Has anything in relationship to that changed with the way you view God or relate to God after walking through suffering?
I just see him as being, he's the person that's in charge of my life. I'm not in charge of my life anymore. Nothing I have belongs to me. My family, they don't belong to me. They belong to God. I belong to him. And I guess I just turn each day over to him a lot better than I used to. And I'm not totally without concern or even anxiety at times, but I do realize that he's in charge of my life.
Yeah. It's interesting how that connects with what you said earlier about before it was, if I could just work hard enough and put everything in
Mm-hmm.
place, then
Mm-hmm.
the outcome should end up being this way. And I'm guessing a situation like that blows that hypothesis out the water.
It does, and I guess, well, one thing that changed for me was my prayer life completely changed. I think before I had asked God for more than I had thanked Him for. I all during the time he was sick, of course, there were people across the United States. He was on every prayer list in every church, I think, and around. And so, we were praying, and I knew the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availed much. And so, we were praying for a healing, and that's not what we got. And toward the end, it became apparent that he wasn't going to be healed of this. And so, I started praying that he wouldn't suffer. And then I started praying that God would go ahead and take him, that he could go on home, to be home with him, because that's what he was ready for, and that's what he wanted. And so my prayer changed. And then after he was gone, it was like I had a hard time even praying. I couldn't formulate the words. And so I knew from studying the Bible that God knew what I was thinking, and I didn't even have to utter them. He knew what I needed, and he could formulate that into words for me. But I was in a grief share class, and someone mentioned on a video that we were watching that they just had started doing what they call thankful prayers because they couldn't pray. They just didn't know what to ask, didn't know how to pray. So they just started doing thankful prayers. And so when sometimes they got caught up in grief so much that they couldn't refocus on anything else, they just started saying, thank you. Thank you for this beautiful home. Thank you for that the grass is green. Thank you that I have clothes on my body. Thank you that I have coffee to drink. Thank you. And it's just really simple, almost juvenile prayers, but it redirects your focus. And sometimes I remember driving to visit my dad in assisted living, and it was a long drive, and all I had to do was think during that time, because I went through a period where I couldn't really listen to music or anything, and so all I had to do was think during that time. So I would pray. I'd start praying when I got in the car because I was really tense and nervous about making the trip, and I would just pray, thank you for those clouds, and thank you for that my tires on my car are good, thank you. And so that thankfulness would redirect me, and that helped me through a lot of times, was just thanking God. And I've found that through that, I tend to be much more thankful now. My prayers always start off with thanking God for whatever, and then they lead into, help me with this and direct me in that way or whatever.
Yeah. That's fascinating to me because it seems a bit counterintuitive, but after you explain it, it makes a lot of sense. Of suffering allows you to be more grateful, and that seems to be a theme of when you found out the diagnosis, you became more grateful to be in relationship with John and wanted to soak that up. And after walking through the suffering, to be able to pray again was not through asking for more things, but being grateful for what God had already given. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what that was like to pray for God to go ahead and let John pass? How did you get to that place, and was that an extremely difficult time?
It was. If someone had told me years before that I'd pray for God to take my husband, I'd said never. I will fight to the last, moment for that. But when you see somebody suffer so much and go through so much and be so strong as he was such a fighter. And so I realized that, he hadn't lost his battle. He was winning. He would win his battle. He would win that if he were to go be with the Lord. And he was to the point that he said, I'm really ready. I want to go. And he was having dreams, and I don't know if you call them visions or whatever toward the end, but anyway, he would say, I'm ready. I'm here. At one time when he was completely unconscious, he sat up in the bed, and he said, John Shoemaker. Like he was stating his name on a manifest list or something. That's the way that's what I took it as. And so he was ready. And so I just, I just lay my hand on his back and pray that he not suffer, and pray that God would go ahead and take him home. And later on, several months after he was gone, one of my friends said this, and it's really stuck with me, and it's brought me a lot of comfort. She said, it just hit me one day that the worst day of my life was the best day of his.
Yeah, that's good.
So I still say that sometimes, when I get to missing him so much.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank
and
you.
I think for me, being able to talk to you and Cheryl, one of the greatest gifts that you've given me is the ability to think about things that you assume are, oh, well, you would never do this, or you try to avoid this. And y'all kind of open my mind that there's certain myths out there about things you should do or shouldn't do when engaging with people that are going through grief and suffering. Would you mind sharing a few that you've learned actually walking through suffering? And before you answer, something that I think you've said in the past that's been really helpful is there's not one size fit all. So it's not like, oh, if you do these 3 things, it works with every person in every situation, because we suffer in very different ways. And so this is not like you're going to give us the silver bullet that solves every problem or every engagement with one who's suffering. But what are some things that people maybe think they shouldn't do or they should do that you found that actually for you wasn't that helpful, or things they did that were very helpful?
Well, I love the way you stated that, because I really don't want to give advice, but I can tell you what things kind of worked for me or what didn't, based upon my experience. And one of the things that I heard over and over was, he's in a better place. And, when I heard that, like at the memorial, and lots of people would say that, he's in a better place. And of course I knew he was in a better place. And I would say, yes, I know that. I take great comfort in that. And then several months out, after I'd heard it probably, hundreds of times, he's in a better place. He's in a better place, as if I had never thought of that myself. It kind of felt like that. I started saying, when somebody would say he's in a better place, I would say, yes, I know that. And I take a great deal of comfort from that. Thank you. But I'm not in a better place. And I would say that just because I needed, I guess, to be validated that I was hurting so desperately. And so I think sometimes, pardon me, I've got to get a little bit teary sometimes.
Absolutely.
But so I think sometimes just not really, there are no words. And sometimes you can just say, there are no words.
Yeah.
I remember when something happened to a couple at our church, and we were all trying to give them comfort, and all I could do was just hug them, because there were no words. I could not even begin to experience what they were going through, because I'd never been there. And so sometimes it's helpful to refrain from saying, I know what you're feeling, or I understand, because sometimes we don't. If we haven't been there, we don't understand. If you've been there, you may understand a lot of aspects in it, and can be a comfort in that way. I kind of think it like this, that we can be a conduit of comfort, not necessarily a container of comfort, because you can come with your bucket of comfort and stand there before someone, and it really doesn't benefit them a lot. But if you can be a conduit for that, if it's sharing common experiences, if it's just hugging, if it's allowing that person just to be able to talk about their loved one, that was a big one for me. Early on, I met someone that was in a grief group that I was in. It was a once-a-month support group. And our bereavement counselor introduced me to her. She said, would you like to meet, may I introduce you to this lady? She said, y'all have a lot in common. I think you would enjoy meeting each other and share some experiences. And so I said, sure, we did. We became immediate friends. And what we did was the first several months, I was talking about John, and she was talking about her husband, Jack. And it was just John, Jack, to the point that we felt, neither of us had met the other spouses, but we felt as if we knew them. We shared so much about them. And that was probably one of the most helpful things that I was allowed to talk about him. Because sometimes people want to shut you down and not talk about that person because they're afraid they'll cause tears. Yeah. So I try to tell people that you're not making me cry. Nothing you did or said made me cry, because I could be walking down the aisle of Kroger and see the M&Ms and it could bring tears, or a song could come on the radio and it could bring tears. So you're not making me cry. It gives me such joy to be able to talk about John, because otherwise it feels like I have to erase my history. If I'm not permitted to talk about him, then there goes half of my life that I can't speak of. And he was such a major part of my life and always will be. And so I'm so grateful when people say, well, tell me about John. What was he like? But it makes me happy. Yeah.
That's been the one thing that you've shared with me that stuck out more than anything, because I know I would always have that anxiety of, is that a touchy subject? Do you try to avoid it? Do you want to? And a couple of things that you just named. One, you love talking about that person, because just because they passed doesn't mean you stop loving them or caring or loving those stories that make you laugh or the stories that make you cry. And also, you've talked about with me, allow us to cry, those people that are grieving, to cry without making it feel like we've ruined a situation or it has to be fixed. We're not asking you to fix it if we're crying. It's just an emotion that we're expressing. So that's been really helpful for me.
Absolutely. Grief is not fixable. And I think that God gave us tears for a reason. And sometimes those tears allow us just to wash away some of the sadness or the heartache in order to renew us to be open to other experiences. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think all my life I felt as if I needed to be strong and present a strong front to people. And I would be whoever you wanted me to be. If you wanted me to be happy, I'd be happy. If you needed me to be consoling, I'd be consoling. But only through this grief have I learned to be really authentic. And so I was always so private and wouldn't share anything. I was happy to try to help or listen to yours, whatever your problem was, but I wasn't going to let go of any of mine. I was keeping everything to myself. But through this, I've learned this. Here it is. This is who I am. So I've shared a lot more through my writing and other ways than I ever thought I would.
Do you have any examples of people that either after John passed or while he was sick that you thought, man, they embodied exactly what it looks like to love somebody who's going through grief and suffering? Do you have any examples or things that you've seen done that you would say, definitely do this? This is a really good example of how to walk with someone who's grieving.
Yes. I went through it before some of my friends, and they have since gone through it. For example, Cheryl and I have gone through so much together and have become such close friends as a result. And we've been able to share that experience. And now Nancy and I are as well. But Nancy showed up for me in ways that I cannot even say before John was gone, and so did Mike Smedley, and the elders and so many other people, but I think of them specifically, and even Roger, taking care of some tasks for me that I couldn't do because of my limitations, either from being needing to be with John, or just because I didn't have the skills to do so. Um, but just sitting with him at times, coming and praying over him. Nancy showed up right after John passed, and she said, I'm going to come out to your house and see what food you need. Because at that time, she would say, what do you need? And everybody would say, what do you need? What do you need? And I didn't know what I needed.
Yeah.
Couldn't even think. And so she said, well, I'm coming out to your house, and if you don't mind, I'm going to look in your refrigerator and see what you have. And so she did, and she took care of it. And so when somebody would say, do you need food, or do you need this or that, would you call Nancy? And Nancy just took care of those everyday things. She just managed to coordinate little things that I couldn't do at that time. Because leading up to it, I had taken care of all the tasks that I thought I could in advance. But when it actually happens and you're actually in the moment, it's hard to concentrate. It's hard to think. And so she was such a help to me. But just being there and not saying, call me if you need anything, but I'm here.
Yeah.
How can I help? How can I help? If I come over, if I drop by, is it okay if I drop by? Can I come by and help you do something? Can I sit with your loved one that's in the hospital or whatever? Can I be there just to help you? May I be there to help you with that and give you just a break for a minute?
Yeah.
But there's no perfect answer. It's just being there, sitting with someone, holding their hand, praying with them, saying, I'm here.
That's really helpful to think about taking the pressure off of the person to have to initiate the needs that they have, that by just saying, may I come over and look in your fridge to see what you might need, took that burden off of saying, oh, I have a need. Now I got to do the texting or calling somebody to ask for help. That person said, I really am available. And I'm not just giving a general kind, oh, I can be available if you need me to, but I'm going to be there. Let me help. And how can I help? I think that's really helpful to think of being more active in our willingness to help instead of passive, to say, well, I'll just wait to see what that person asked for. Like be active in saying, I want to do this. Let me help you in this way. That's really helpful. So,
exactly. She was the conduit.
yes.
Everybody has a container of comfort, but you have to have a conduit to get it there. And so so many people did that and were so helpful to me in that way.
So if you were to give a word of encouragement, this came up in our life group, to people that go, okay, I freeze up. Like I want to be that conduit. I want to be that loving presence, but I feel so much pressure and anxiety when I'm around somebody who I know is going through grief, because I'm so worried they're going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. I'm going to mess up. Do you have any word of encouragement for people like that?
You're not going to mess up. You're not going to mess up. Whatever you do, just do the best. I would suggest that you, again, maybe refrain from comparisons or telling your story, but rather just listen and maybe say, can you tell me about him? Hey, I'd love to look at some photographs. Do you have an album that you'd like to share with me? Or even like on Facebook, when I post a picture of John and someone comes back with a comment, it's like, hey, that was the funniest guy ever. I just love that man. Or he was such a nut. It just, it means so much to me. So just allowing that person to talk about the loved one and being open with that. Just don't worry about doing wrong. Just be there. Just show up. Because sometimes, we may not, in our grief, we may not remember everybody that showed up and every way that they helped us. But sometimes we remember those that don't. And I know that many times it is just because they don't know what to do or don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And if you're grieving and that happens to you, I just say, give them grace. Give them grace, because most of the time people have really good intentions. It's just they don't know what to do or say.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's helpful. And even in this conversation, you haven't said, I remember this was specifically said, but you've said over and over again, I remember this being done, or I remember feeling this way when I was engaging with the person. And it's amazing. We spend all our time thinking about, what do I say? But people, as they walk through grief, very rarely remember specific words, but they remember what they
Right.
felt like when someone was present, or how they did something and how they engaged with them. And that, I think that takes a little pressure off of, oh, I got to figure out the perfect thing to say, because that's not even the thing that sticks with people that are walking through grief.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just sometimes I just tear up when I think about some of the things that some people from our church did in ways that our church family, the way they showed up for us, and just small things, but they stand out so much in my mind and mean so much to me. Memories I'll never forget, because it was so helpful.
So I want to
Just little
transition
things.
to talking a little bit about your ministry, When We Becomes Me.
Mhm.
I think that's been a gift to a lot of people that have gone through suffering. It's an intentional way that you and others have are walking with people that are going through grief. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it came about?
Okay. When We Becomes Me is a ministry where we provide grief support for women who've lost their husbands to death. And we often say grieving wives, because some people, even though the word widows is in the Bible over and over, sometimes that word, it just feels harsh to people. So we often say, grieving wives. We provide weekend retreats for them. And let me back up a little bit and just tell you how it came about. About a year and a half after John passed, I was feeling pretty lost, and I was looking for something. Didn't know what, but I needed someone who could identify with me. I needed a community of people who could understand where I was coming from, and I had been praying about that, and I'd been really just praying for purpose. I remember just falling down on my knees in the bedroom one day and just saying, God, give me purpose. Give me some purpose in my life. And because I was completely different than I had been before. My purpose for so long had been a wife and a caregiver. And just fairly shortly thereafter, one day at church, Lisa Todd came up to me and she said, I would really like to have breakfast with you and a couple of other ladies and just talk about something that's on my heart. And so we did. And she was thinking about something because some of us that met together that morning for breakfast were widows. And she was thinking at the time about pairing up orphans, because she was working a lot with the children's home, and she was thinking about pairing the two of us up. And I told her real quickly, and we laugh about this so much now. I said, now, Lisa, if you're looking for someone to do more volunteering, right now I have my hands full. I said,
Right.
I have twice the work to do that I did
Yeah.
before. But she said, no, I want to be a help. I want to be a servant. And how could we be a help? And I told her about, I said, I'd love to see us do some kind of a retreat. And she said, tell me more. And she said, I'm in. And so she and I and a couple of other ladies, a couple of ladies that are widows, Lisa's not, but she just had a heart for widows. The four of us started meeting and brainstorming and praying. And I got in contact with the While We're Waiting organization. It's a ministry here in just outside of Hot Springs that ministers to parents who've lost their children.
Yeah.
So we just we started planning, and we ended up just real quickly putting together a retreat for women, and we got a Facebook presence and a web page. And so what we do is we have widows from all around. They come from throughout the state and lots of other states now for a weekend of grief support. We start on a Friday night and we go all weekend through about noon Sunday. And we just, we want to have that community for them so they can find people that understand their unique situation. And we want them to learn to, if they're not already, to help them to depend more upon God. So the focus for the weekend, it's all God-centered. There's a lot of prayer. There are a lot of, we share our experiences, we share our stories, but we also share things that we found to be helpful, and it's just to hopefully to help them refocus on what's important and to find hope through God. And it's been so amazing to me, and it was so much work in the beginning, so much work, and it still is a lot of work, but we've expanded to the point that now we have lots of volunteers that help us. And so, but it's well, I lost my train of thought. I forgot where I was going with that. That happens often. So what else is
So how could someone support it? What would you look for members at NPC? What's the best way to be supportive of your ministry?
Well, the church has been supportive through outreach. They've helped us financially, but we have a lot of members there that volunteer and help us. Even recently, and those that are volunteers are only widows, but or unless they're doing something in the background. But like Kim recently helped us by providing some materials for a craft activity. Anything that they would want to do. One of our members of the church said this year, instead of Christmas gifts, would you just make a donation to when we become SMEN? And that we're so grateful for that. She said, I don't need anything else. So our goal with doing this weekend is to do it at no cost, because there are different organizations, different retreats throughout the United States, but some of them are thousands of dollars, and then people have to find transportation to get there. And typically when someone loses her husband, the financial situation changes. Right. So a lot of the women that come to our retreat are, they couldn't afford to come financially if it weren't supported. So that's one way. The best way is just to pray for us, just to continue to pray for our ministry and pray for that we do a good work, and that the women are comforted and they realize that in their grief journey, their Emmaus walk, that God is right there with them all along. And I would like to emphasize that, sometimes when people hear the word widows, they think just older women like me, 60 and above or whatever.
You're not old.
Oh, well, some days I feel as if I am. But they think of people that, well, they've had a good long life. They had a long marriage with their spouse. And so, death is something that happens, but we minister to a lot of really young women. We've had grieving wives that are as young as 22, 29. We have lots in their 30s and 40s. And some of them have several children at home. I had one that had four children under the age of 5 at home. And so sometimes they've lost their main source of income. They've lost their best friend. They've lost their companion. There are just so many secondary losses. And so just continue to pray for these young women, that young women or older women. We've had them, as I said, as young as 22, as old as 85. And but the hurt is the same. It's amazing how they relate to each other, younger, older, because that heartbreak is still the same.
No, that's something we definitely can do. And I know we've talked about it before, but I think your ministry is incredible. And I know it takes a huge team to bring it all together, but I think that is a form of being a conduit of allowing God's love to pour through in a very difficult situation. And so as we're coming to a close, I would love for us for you to be able to share a word of encouragement to those that are suffering, even if it's not the loss of a spouse or a loved one. I know that there are plenty of people in our church right now, obviously in our world with the coronavirus, but just in our congregation, that are going through difficult things that are causing pain and anxiety. After walking through a particular kind of grief and suffering, do you have a word of encouragement for anybody who's going through that in an intense way right now?
Well, it's not just a word. I'm
You can
pretty
use more than
visual,
one
so
word.
if I could give you a little, if I could give you a little analogy, and this is how I sort of think about whatever kind of grief or difficult time you're going through. The Bible says that our grief, our mourning will turn to joy. And so thinking about the word mourning, mourning and morning, I'm thinking about how when it's really dark at night, and you think about when there are no stars out or no moon or anything, it's really, really black, and it's really disorienting.
Yeah.
We just can't see any possible way that we can find our way through that darkness. And it seems as if it's going to go on forever. But then the gray starts creeping in, and you start to be able to make out certain images and think, well, maybe there's hope. And then the sky starts to turn to pink, and then it's a little orange, and before you know it, it's turned to this brilliant, beautiful sun that lights our way. And so, it always daylight always comes. It just sometimes seems like it's forever in getting there, but just hang on to that hope and watch for those colors as they start to change. And it doesn't mean that darkness won't creep back in occasionally, but that our mourning does turn to joy eventually. God always makes something good out of something bad. It always turns out that way.
Amen. Thank you so much. I thank you for having this conversation with us. I always feel energized, and I feel the presence of God when I have conversations with you. And so thank you for doing that. Do you mind if I say a prayer as we kind of close this conversation out?
Well, thank you. And I'd love that.
Yeah. God, you are so good. And conversations like this are a reminder why we're grateful to be part of your body. I can't imagine trying to think about or walk through suffering and grief without fellow Christians to walk with us, to encourage us, and to think through how we can process the difficulties of life. As we just finished hearing, thank you for being a God who works all things together for good, because this world is oftentimes extremely broken and filled with pain, but we thank you for being a God who brings things together for good. God, help us to be a conduit of your love and your peace and your comfort in a world that really needs it. And we're so thankful that Jesus is that for us. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen. Thank you again, Lana. And National Park Church, we're going to be having more of these kinds of conversations. And I just encourage you to be, as Lana encouraged us to be, that conduit of God's love in the moments of suffering of life. Have a great week.